They looked like the kind of family you'd envy. A respected pastor, his elegant wife, two well-behaved teens, and a mother-in-law who still came around for Sunday dinners. The Watkins home on Sycamore Street in Jackson County didn't make the news. It made potluck rosters, school board donations, and quiet small talk about good people. But behind closed doors, something was breaking. Not all at once. Slowly, quietly, like a crack forming beneath the paint of a perfect wall. It started with a girl who didn't know where she truly came from, and ended with 3 dead bodies in the backyard, a wedding gown still folded in plastic, and a gun with 1 bullet left. Whatever happened inside that house, it was never about love. The 2-story home on the corner of Sycamore and Lowell Avenue sat quietly behind a trimmed hedge and a white picket fence. James Watkins had lived there for nearly 2 decades. Around town, he was referred to simply as Pastor James. His sermons were said to be balanced and firm, rarely emotional, but always orderly. He dressed cleanly, often in gray or navy suits. A man who believed in discipline, in structure, in control. His wife, Natalie, carried herself like the woman behind a man who held such power. She wasn't loud, but she wasn't invisible either. People described her as polished, always neatly dressed, always composed, always respectful. The kind of woman who remembered birthdays and brought a covered dish to every funeral. Their children completed the picture. Rebecca, Becky, as some of her classmates called her, was a slender, soft-spoken teenager who didn't get in trouble. Her classmates at William Chrisman High said she was kind, even if a little quiet. Noah, her slightly older brother, was adopted several years ago. A foster system kid brought into the home through Natalie's initiative, Noah was more expressive, more inquisitive, and occasionally outspoken, but always respectful. The Watkins home was orderly. Rules were clear. Even when Miranda Jones, Natalie's mother, came visiting, the household didn't change. She'd bring homemade pies, help trim the garden, and sometimes stay the night if Natalie wasn't feeling well. She was sharp-witted but measured, a woman who'd raised daughters in the church and still kept her Bible marked with colored tabs. To neighbors, Miranda added warmth to an already respectable family. But not everything was as neat as the hedges outside. Occasionally, people whispered about how Becky seemed different. Not rebellious, just set apart. Pastor James seemed to favor her in subtle ways, calling her sweetheart in public, placing a hand on her shoulder with a kind of quiet reverence. Natalie, meanwhile, was harder to read. She smiled in public. She served tea when guests arrived, but there were moments, a glance, a tightened jaw, a faraway stare at the dinner table, when she looked as though she were somewhere else entirely. Noah noticed things too, like how his father figure's tone changed when speaking to Becky, or how he and Becky were never left alone in the house together. He never asked questions. He wasn't raised to challenge order. But he watched. And he remembered. Behind the curtains of that 2-story house, not everyone knew their place. And one secret had already been buried for years. At first glance, Rebecca Watkins didn't demand attention. She wasn't loud or brash. She didn't post TikToks or dye her hair like other girls her age. She spoke in soft tones and made A's and B's in school. She sat with folded hands at the dinner table. But anyone who spent real time around the Watkins family eventually noticed Rebecca moved through the house like someone set apart. She had a quiet kind of gravity to her, one that didn't come from rebellion or ego, but from being different. And no one reflected that difference more clearly than James Watkins. It was subtle, never inappropriate on the surface. But there was a softness in his eyes when he looked at her, one that didn't extend to anyone else. He always seemed to understand what she meant, even when she hadn't spoken clearly. If Noah asked a question, he was told to think harder. If Rebecca hesitated, James offered help. It was the kind of favoritism that rarely raised eyebrows, but always left a trace. Natalie noticed it too. Her ways of managing it were harder to read. She hovered near Rebecca often, offering snacks she wouldn't eat, brushing lint off her clothes that wasn't there, asking questions that had no real answers. Protective, almost to the point of paranoia. But still, there was a distance in her efforts, as if she was watching something unfold that she could not stop, something she'd chosen, perhaps long ago, to quietly endure. Noah, meanwhile, carried the weight of not quite belonging. He had joined the family through the state's foster program 5 years earlier. By all outward standards, he had been given a second chance. A stable home, a private school, new clothes. But the warmth that was spoken of in church didn't always make it to the dinner table. Pastor James treated him fairly, but coldly. Like a charity case that needed upkeep, not connection. There were no family portraits on the wall that included him. At school, Becky and Noah were assumed to be twins by classmates who didn't know better. But at home, they lived on opposite sides of a line that neither could fully explain. Noah once asked Becky why their rooms were on different floors. She didn't have an answer. Their shared history, when mentioned, was always vague. Church friends remembered Rebecca joining the family as a miracle baby. After years of James and Natalie struggling with infertility, the story always ended with a smile and a praise report. No details, no hospital photos, no awkward baby shower memories. Just a child, suddenly part of a picture that had been waiting to be filled. Becky seemed to understand that she was special, but not why. She didn't act entitled. If anything, she seemed burdened by the attention. When Pastor James would place his hand gently on her shoulder in front of others, she'd smile, but her eyes often dropped. She had a journal she never let anyone read. And some nights, when the house was quiet, she'd wander out onto the back porch barefoot, staring into the dark with the kind of stillness that didn't match her age. One night, a week after her 16th birthday, Noah found her there again, barefoot, shivering slightly in the fall air. "You good?" he asked casually. She nodded, then hesitated. "Just had a weird dream." Noah looked at her, waiting. "He says we're special," she continued, almost in a whisper. "That it's different with me." There was no explanation, just those words. Quiet, waited, and gone. Noah didn't ask who he was. He didn't have to. He already knew. In the attic of the Watkins home, under a patchwork quilt and a locked cedar box, were a dozen digital tapes no one else had seen. Natalie recorded them late at night, sometimes before bed, sometimes after her husband left for early morning church business. They were dated, time-stamped, methodical. But they weren't sermons. They were confessions, to no one in particular. Or perhaps to God. Or maybe just to herself. The recordings didn't always follow a pattern. Some were shot in the attic, others in the backyard garden where she often weeded in silence. A few took place inside her walk-in closet, her back pressed against the shelves, eyes red from tears that didn't fall. The lighting was dim. Her voice was never raised. But what she said was always soaked in something more than sadness, something like resignation. "I prayed for years," she said in one entry, her hands wrapped around a half-drunk mug of tea. "And when he answered, it wasn't how I expected. But I said yes anyway." In another, "She loves him more than me. Not in a wrong way, just in a way that doesn't leave room." She rarely used names, never pointed fingers. And yet, through each quiet clip, a picture began to form, not of scandal, but of sorrow. A woman holding together a house, a family, a legacy, with nothing tethered to her soul but duty. A woman whose silence had cost her more than words ever could. "I took in what wasn't mine," she whispered in one of the final clips. "I gave him peace. I gave her love. But I've received nothing." These entries never left the attic. No one knew they existed. Not her daughter, not her husband, not even her mother, until it was too late. It was a Sunday afternoon when Noah Carter found it. The house was quiet. Pastor James had taken the family's only car to run errands. Natalie was asleep upstairs, and Becky was in the backyard pruning rose stems with quiet intensity. Noah had just come out of the shower when he noticed the small plastic stick sticking halfway out of the bathroom trash. At first, it didn't register. He nudged the bin with his foot, saw the faint pink lines, and leaned down for a closer look. 2 lines. Bold, unmistakable, positive. His mind raced. He grabbed a tissue and lifted it, checking the brand. It wasn't old. It hadn't even been used 12 hours earlier. It was fresh. His first thought wasn't Becky. Maybe it belonged to a friend. Maybe someone from church had come by and tossed it here. But that didn't track. The only people who'd used the bathroom in the past day were family. Natalie? No. She was nearing 50. Miranda? Unlikely. And Natalie would have told her. That left one person. The next morning, Noah started paying closer attention. Becky skipped breakfast, claiming her stomach hurt. At lunch, she barely touched her food. She looked pale and moved slower than usual. That evening, he heard her crying in the upstairs hallway. She said she was just tired. But Noah had grown up around people who lied to survive. He recognized the tone. It was fear. 2 nights later, after Natalie had gone to bed and the house was still, he found Becky sitting on the back steps, arms around her knees. "I found the test," he said quietly. Becky immediately confessed everything to him. The next day, he took his old Android, cracked screen, barely held a charge, and cleaned off enough space for one long recording. He tested camera angles, measured light, practiced asking questions without sounding like an interrogation. That evening, while Natalie was running errands and James was leading Bible study, he called Becky into his room under the pretense of needing help with homework. He set the phone on his shelf, tilted against a book, lens barely visible between a stack of notebooks. They sat on the floor. Becky picked at her nails. "I just don't get it," Noah said softly. "Why would someone do that to you?" She hesitated. "He said we'd be fine, that it wasn't like the others, that God made us for each other." Noah swallowed. "You mean, Dad?" Becky flinched. The next few minutes unraveled like string, loose, trembling, fragile. Becky didn't say it directly, but she didn't deny anything either. She spoke in fragments, mentioned nights when Natalie was out of town, walks behind the church when no one was around, phrases that hinted at a grooming far older than the test in the trash. Noah didn't stop recording. He didn't say a word. He just let it play. When she left the room, he waited until he heard her door shut, then grabbed the phone, locked the video, and placed it in a folder he labeled Homework 1. He was about to embark on a deadly mission. The table was set with care that evening. Natalie had made roast chicken, steamed carrots, and cornbread from scratch. The ceramic dishes were ones she reserved for holidays, but this dinner wasn't tied to any occasion. She'd just said she wanted togetherness, a calm evening. All of them at the table. No distractions. James sat at the head, napkin draped neatly across his lap, carving knife in hand. Becky sat to his right, her shoulders tense but composed. Noah across from her, eyes darting between the room and the phone in his pocket. Natalie, unusually quiet, took the seat closest to the kitchen, while Miranda settled beside her, humming low as she buttered a roll. Small talk floated like smoke. Church updates. Becky's upcoming exams. Weather. Miranda's arthritis. James spoke easily, as he always did when presiding over something, be it sermon, meeting, or supper. But underneath it all, something heavier throbbed in the room. Halfway through the meal, as James reached for a second helping, Noah cleared his throat. "Can I show y'all something?" he said, voice light but shaking. "It's just something important. I think we all should see it." Everyone paused. Noah stood. "Just a clip on my phone. I'll cast it to the TV." He walked to the living room, where the television faced the table, pulled the HDMI cord from its coil, and plugged in the adapter. No one spoke as the screen blinked to life. The room dimmed. Then, a shaky image filled the screen. Rebecca, sitting cross-legged on the floor. Her voice faint. "He said it was God's plan." Becky's head snapped toward the screen. "He said we were chosen." Silence. Becky dropped her fork. Her hand flew to her mouth. Tears welled instantly. Miranda sat frozen, blinking at the screen, her eyes wide. Natalie stood slowly, her chair scraping the floor behind her. Then silence. The recording ended. No one breathed. Rebecca broke first. Her sob burst out like a floodgate. "I'm sorry," she cried. He said we'd be okay. He said—" Miranda let out a single sharp cry, something between rage and heartbreak. Natalie's knees buckled. She braced herself against the table, mouth open, eyes fixed on her husband. James didn't move. Not at first. His face emptied of emotion, like a switch flipped. Cold. Robotic. He stood up, slowly, adjusting his collar. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the room. Noah moved toward Becky. Miranda rose, reaching for Natalie. That's when they heard the drawer slide open. Natalie's eyes widened. "James?" But it was too late. He came back in holding a silenced Glock, matte black, tucked low against his thigh. In 3 quick steps, he raised it. The first shot hit Noah in the neck. He dropped immediately. The second tore through Miranda's chest. She collapsed backward, knocking over her chair. Natalie's scream filled the room. Sharp. Guttural. "James! No!" He fired again. Natalie crumpled beside the stove, her blood soaking into the kitchen rug. Rebecca shrieked, crawling under the table, trembling uncontrollably. James didn't chase her. He stood still, breathing heavily, looking at the bodies as if waiting for confirmation they were real. Then, without a word, he turned off the TV. Dinner was over. James stood among the bodies for several minutes, unmoving, his breath shallow, the silencer still warm in his hand. Rebecca hadn't run. She was on her knees behind the couch, arms locked around herself like a cage. Her whole body trembled, but she didn't speak. She didn't scream. Something had shut off inside her, something necessary to survive. He called her name once, calmly. She didn't move. He walked toward her and crouched, placing a hand gently on her arm. "We don't have time," he said softly. "Come help me." She followed. There was no pleading, no begging for mercy, no attempt to run or call for help, just movement, mechanized, hollow, as if she were watching herself from a distance. James rolled up his sleeves and brought out the tarp from the garage. They wrapped Natalie first, then Miranda, then Noah. Each body was heavier than the last, not just in weight, but in memory. Rebecca held the flashlight. In the far corner of the backyard, behind the shed, and under the shadow of a massive oak tree, James had once started a garden he never finished. That's where he dug. The ground was soft from a recent rain, but the digging still took hours. Shovel in hand, he worked in silence, sweat darkening his shirt. Rebecca stood nearby, motionless, her shoes sunk into the mud. Her hands were stained red, though she never touched the bodies directly. She held the flashlight steady. That was her part. The holes weren't deep. James knew they didn't need to be. They just had to hold. By the time he finished, the sky was turning navy blue. The first hint of morning crept over the rooftops, and the wind shifted. He wiped his brow, took one final look at the disturbed soil, and exhaled. When he turned to Rebecca, his face softened again. "It's done," he said. "We're free now." She didn't respond. He stepped closer, brushed hair from her face. This is our beginning," he whispered. "No more pretending. No more hiding. You and me. Just like it was meant to be." James went inside first, rinsed his hands in the sink, and packed a small overnight bag. He grabbed the emergency cash from the attic crawl space. By the time Rebecca entered the house again, it was like nothing had happened. The lights were off, the blood cleaned, the kitchen smelled like bleach. "We'll leave before sunrise," James said. And they did. Just as the neighborhood began to stir, garbage trucks rumbling in the distance, sprinklers kicking on, James Watkins and his daughter climbed into his car and drove away from Sycamore Street. No note. No explanation. Just 2 bags. And a white envelope he slid under the front door of the church. Where they were going, he said, no one would find them. Because this was the life he claimed they were meant to live. The room at the Green Pines Motor Inn smelled faintly of mildew and ammonia. The curtains were stiff, the bedspreads floral and faded. A sagging love seat sat by the window, flanked by a warped side table with a chipped lamp. It was the kind of place where people disappeared into anonymity, not the kind of place a man brought his daughter to start a new life. But that's exactly what James Watkins intended. He checked in under a fake name, paid in cash, and requested no housekeeping. Rebecca stood beside him the whole time, arms crossed tightly, eyes blank. Inside the room, she sat on the edge of the bed, while he unpacked the duffel. He talked to her the way one speaks to a bride-to-be. Calm, assured, almost joyful. As if nothing horrifying had happened in the past 48 hours. As if the ground behind their house in Jackson County wasn't holding the bodies of her mother, her brother, and her grandmother. That night, he went out alone. Said he needed to take care of something. He returned 3 hours later with a white garment bag, a thrift store plastic bag, and a cheap bouquet of fake white lilies. "I found it," he said with a grin, holding the garment bag like a trophy. "Simple, elegant. You'll look beautiful in it." She didn't open it, didn't ask what was inside, but she already knew. The next morning, he woke early, ironed his second-hand suit on the motel's mini ironing board. He looked at Rebecca through the reflection and smiled. "If no one agrees to marry us," he said, adjusting his collar, "I'll do it myself. Legally, it's tricky, but spiritually, we've already been joined. The rest is formality." Still, she didn't speak. But something inside her had shifted. It wasn't clarity, not yet, but a flicker, a faint pulse beneath the fog. The beginnings of a question. Is this really how it ends? She watched him move through the room, folding, humming, sipping instant coffee like it was sacred, and she began to see him differently. Not as her father, not even as her abuser, but as a man who had built an entire fantasy around control, and who would destroy anything that refused to fit into it. Her stomach turned. The weight of the baby inside her pressed heavier than before. James reached into the duffel, pulled out a small black leather-bound book, and placed it on the nightstand. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll say our vows." Rebecca nodded, slowly. But behind her nod, something was forming. Not love, not forgiveness. Something else. Something sharper. The motel was silent, except for the muffled hum of the highway in the distance and the rhythmic drip of water from the bathroom faucet. The room felt smaller that morning, as if the walls were pressing inward. The air was heavy, more humid than usual from the rising steam behind the bathroom door. James Watkins stood shirtless in front of the mirror, humming as he ran an electric razor across his jaw. He was preparing like it was sacred. Like this moment, this grotesque imitation of a wedding day, was something holy. Rebecca sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clenched in her lap. She hadn't slept. Not well. Not in days. The cheap white dress hung from a coat hook on the wall like a ghost watching her. The gun was in the duffel bag. He had packed it carelessly, somewhere beneath folded socks and an extra belt. She had seen it when he opened the bag the night before, just a glimpse of the metal, still smeared faintly with dried blood. Now he was distracted. The shower clicked on. Hot water hissed against old tile. Through the half-closed door, she could see the silhouette of his movement, arms raised, hands washing. She stood, moved slowly, deliberately. The duffel sat unzipped on the table. She reached in, pushing past shirts, a roll of bills, toiletries. Her fingers closed around it. Cold, solid, heavier than she remembered. She stepped back toward the bathroom door. Her heart hammered in her ears. Her breath came in short, shallow pulls. Inside the bathroom, James sang softly, an old gospel tune he'd used to lull congregations into a trance. He was in his element, comfortable, naked, unarmed. She raised the gun. Her hands trembled. She didn't scream, didn't say his name. She just pulled the trigger. The first shot echoed like thunder in that tiny room. James collapsed against the shower wall, sliding down in a slow, wet heap. His eyes never opened. Rebecca stared for a second, then fired again. The water ran red. She dropped the gun on the floor, stepped back, collapsed onto the bed, gasping. For a long time she sat motionless, knees to her chest, palms pressed to her face. The silence returned, but it wasn't peaceful. It was final. Eventually, she stood, walked to the phone mounted to the wall beside the motel door. The buttons felt foreign beneath her fingers. She dialed. It rang once. Then a voice. 911. What's your emergency? Her voice cracked, hollow and low. I killed him. He killed them. Please, just come. She didn't say her name, didn't say the address. She didn't have to. They were already looking for her. When authorities arrived at the Green Pines Motor Inn, they didn't know what they were walking into. A girl, barefoot, pale, covered in blood, opened the door and raised her hands before they even asked. Inside, they found James Watkins slumped in the bathtub, 2 bullets to the chest, water still running over his body. Rebecca Watkins was taken into protective custody. No charges, no handcuffs, just quiet. But back in Jackson County, the real story was just beginning to unfold. Investigators secured the Watkins home within hours. Neighbors stood outside in confusion as police cars swarmed Sycamore Street. No one could explain the sudden disappearance. The house had been quiet. Too quiet. And now, something terrible was buried beneath its silence. In the backyard, cadaver dogs led officers directly to the garden behind the shed. The ground was soft, the earth disturbed. 3 shallow graves were uncovered within hours. Miranda Jones, Natalie Watkins, Noah Carter. Autopsies confirmed gunshot wounds. No hesitation. All killed at close range. While processing the home, a junior forensic analyst noticed a half-cracked cedar box in the attic. Inside, a stack of digital tapes. Dated. Organized. Dusty, but intact. They were turned over to investigators who assumed they were church sermons or financial logs. They weren't. They were Natalie's video diaries, and they told a story no one saw coming. "I took in what wasn't mine," she said in one clip, eyes hollow. "And for 15 years, I made peace with that." In another, "She's not mine by blood. She's my sister's. But he won't let me say that." The room went still. Natalie had known all along. 15 years ago, in the 7th year of her marriage, Natalie's younger sister, Nia Jones, had visited them briefly during a turbulent stretch in her own life. It was only meant to be a few days. But one night, with Natalie out of town for a church retreat, Nia and James had an encounter, something both denied for years afterward. Months later, Nia left Missouri, vanished without explanation, and when a baby arrived under unclear circumstances, Natalie stepped in, adopted the child under sealed records, named her Rebecca. She told no one. Nia never returned, never fought for her child, never made contact. Rebecca grew up believing Natalie was her mother, but the truth had lived quietly inside Natalie all those years. The truth that her husband had fathered a child with her own sister, and she, in her desperation to hold on to family, had raised that child as her own. The DNA confirmed everything. Rebecca wasn't Natalie's biological daughter. She was Nia's, and James had known from the beginning. Authorities pieced together the layers with growing horror. A man who abused his position. A woman who silenced her pain. A child raised under the weight of a lie too large to carry. But even with all the evidence, tapes, graves, blood, DNA, one question still hung in the air. Why didn't anyone see it? The answer, investigators agreed, lay in the same silence that covered Sycamore Street for years. The kind of silence that doesn't scream. It whispers, and it hides. Yet somehow, in the thick of it, Rebecca didn't become the criminal. The investigation confirmed the timeline, confirmed the abuse, confirmed that she had acted alone in the final moments, armed with a gun she hadn't fired until survival demanded it. She was 15. She had no priors, no history of violence, just a womb full of trauma, and a face that now seemed permanently caught between guilt and grief. After a psychological evaluation, the state deemed her unfit for juvenile detention, but not unstable. She was placed in temporary foster care. She didn't speak much at first. Not about what happened, not about what came next. She delivered the baby in early spring, a boy, healthy, quiet, like her. She didn't name him, didn't ask to hold him. She just signed the papers and stared at the ceiling while the nurse wheeled him away. She never asked where he went, and no one told her. She began attending therapy 3 times a week. At first she resisted. Then she started drawing. Then speaking. Eventually, when asked what she wanted to do with her life, she said, barely above a whisper, "I think I want to help people like me." Social workers noted her clarity. She began taking online classes while in care. She read books about trauma, boundaries, healing. She stopped flinching when people touched her shoulder. She started asking questions again. But there were days, still too many, when she couldn't sleep. When the memory of dirt under her fingernails, of blood on linoleum, of her brother's eyes as he fell to the ground, gripped her like a vice. The town moved on. Sort of. The Watkins Church was quietly shuttered. The board disbanded. No farewell service, no candlelight vigil, just locked doors and silence. The house on Sycamore Street still stands. It was sold at auction to a family who never asked about its history. They painted the fence, tore down the shed, filled in the garden. They have 2 kids, a dog, and new blinds that stay closed most of the time. But every now and then, someone drives past and slows down. Not to see the new paint, not to admire the porch, but to look, just for a second, at the place where silence once screamed, where love was twisted into something unrecognizable, where a girl lost everything she knew, and somehow still found the strength to walk away. Rebecca Watkins will never be normal, but she is alive. And for now, that's enough.